George H.W. Bush's final journey is now look at these pictures from the crowds as his journey comes to an end here. Wow. There's a train now carrying the 41st president's casket. It's arriving at College Station, Texas, following a funeral this morning in Houston, following yesterday's state funeral. This remarkable scene played out as the train passed through the small towns. You're looking at a camera mounted on the side of the train there as thousands just come out behind that fence to wave and see that train pass by, able to catch a glimpse of the casket. In a short while, Mr. Bush will be buried in a private ceremony at his presidential library on the campus of Texas A&M University. Joining me here in studio is Ed O'Keefe. Major Garrett is in Washington, and Chip Reed is in College Station. Chip, let me just toss to you first, since you're there. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary looking at these images.
Yeah, Jeff, I lost you there. Jeff, I lost your audio there, but let me answer the question I think you were going to ask, which is that what is the connection between George Bush and Texas A&M, because he went to Yale. Well, as soon as he became president in 1989, graduates of Texas A&M, in particular one oil man who was a good friend of Bush, approached him and said, we would like Texas A&M to be the place where you build your presidential library. They renamed a road right through the middle of campus, George Bush Drive, and in 1991 he said, okay, you've got it. I'm going to put my presidential library right there. Jeff?
Very good point. Thank you, Chip. We were just talking about that here in studio before before we went on with the special report here, because the president did have offers basically from Yale, and he went to Yale. He lived in Houston, and Rice is in Houston, and also Texas A&M. But for some reason, the former president fell in love with Texas A&M and became an Aggie, and that's why his library is there, and that's where he will. That's where he will be following today as the 6 days of public mourning for the 41st president concludes. Major Garrett, to you in Washington, and again, there's just there's an enormous outpouring of support for the president in Texas here today.
Tremendous outpouring of support in Texas. Jeff, myself, I consider myself an adopted Texan. I was born in California. My father was born in Baytown, Texas, just outside of Houston. I worked twice in Texas before coming to Washington. And I know most Texans don't travel by train, but the train trip to Texas A&M from Houston, deeply symbolic. Trains in America symbolize our expansion westward. They also symbolize the transformation of our economy from agrarian to industrial. It's worth noting that during George H.W. Bush's presidency, our country was beginning to make the transition from an industrial to digital economy. So there is a symbolism there as well. And as we see these pictures play out and the preparations made, one other thing I'd like to point out, Jeff, for everyone who has either been as a law enforcement official or member of the military who's participated in any part of these ceremonies the last 4 to 5 days, we can say with certain simplicity that for the rest of their lives, they will tell their spouses, their friends, their family, their children, I was there when our country said goodbye to the 41st president. They will remember that. They will remember each and every symbolic moment of pageantry, moment of grandeur, and say, I was there to help say goodbye to a president. For those Americans who participated in whatever way this whole week has been for them, I'm sure, unforgettable.
I know we're all thankful that we were been able to watch all of this, both in D.C. yesterday, now here in New York, and then, of course, folks stationed in College Station as well. Ed O'Keefe, as we take a look at the pictures of George W. Bush on the train.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. We were talking about this earlier for those who weren't with us, that we had been advised by people who have helped prepare this entire week of commemoration that those on the Bush staff, those closest to the family, said this was the coolest, most poignant part of the week that they were most looking forward to. He took this ride through some really tiny towns in Texas. Magnolia, only 2,000 people live there. They stopped, slowed down a little bit in Tomball, a population roughly 11,000. And they've pulled up there to Navasota with a population of 7,600. When George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush first came to Texas, they were in it was a red two-door Studebaker that took them to Texas from Connecticut after he graduated from Yale. And he'd been presented a few times with opportunities to come back here to New York to work for Wall Street firms close to his father, who was a senator at the time. And he writes in his diaries and his letters about how he mulled it over with her quite seriously, but they decided he wanted to stay and be part of the oil business and watch the development and the transformation of Texas. And so that's why he opted to stay there and why he's returning to it today.
The rest is history. People have been leaving coins on the tracks along this route to be flattened then into keepsakes.
Really?
Which then isn't that wonderful? And they take home. Let's just pause here for a moment as the first son gets off the train.
Where no rockets fly, nor bullets ring, our broken brothers let us bring to the mansions of the Lord. No more pleading, no more fight, no prayers pleading through the night. Just divine embrace, eternal light in the mansions of the Lord, where no mothers cry and no children weep. We will stand and guard though the angels sleep. All through the ages safely keep the mansions of the
Just been listening to the Singing Cadets. The family in position, honorary pallbearers and their spouses will be escorted into position here. Members of the procession, national colors, military and civilian clergy, casket, and presidential color. Just look at the delicacy involved. The white gloves. heard the Aggie War Hymn, which was preceded by Hail to the Chief. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ed. I don't know if that's the last time that Hail to the Chief will be played for.
And the first time we've heard the Aggie War Hymn this
41st
entire
president.
week, yes.
Or is it one more time at the library?
Might be, yes. I've been struck, Jeff, watching the Bushes this week. There's a letter that he wrote to his two oldest sons about 20 years ago when they were starting to run for governor. And there were concerns about whether they should try to put some distance between themselves and him, because, of course, he was a former one-term president. And he wrote to them pretty poignantly, and he said, at some point, both of you may want to say, well, I don't agree with my dad on that point, or frankly, I think Dad was wrong about that. Do it, he wrote. Chart your own course, not just on the issues, but on defining yourselves. No one will ever question your love of family, your devotion to your parents. And they've been pretty devoted and quite...
There was never a personal vanity that would allow, that he would allow to be interfered with, or the ambitions of his children.
And similarly, George W. made a similar point to Jeb during the 2016 campaign. If you have to put distance between yourself and us, do it because we know you love us. And they certainly have demonstrated that throughout this week.
As we watch so this will be about a 5-minute ride from the arrival at the train station here in College Station to the actual presidential library. Major Garrett's still with us in D.C. Major, maybe you can talk a little bit more about family as we look at them, as to Ed's point about the legacy and the passing of the political ambition, but also the sons charting their own courses.
And necessary lionizing of the legacy of a president who has passed, we should also not be shy about saying this was a political family with political instincts and political ambitions. And yes, you can say two things and they can both be true. Chart your own course and distance yourself from me if you need to achieve the political office you're seeking. Because that's a good thing. It's part of public service. It's also part of your ambition. And it's part of our family approach to defining service. And two things can be true simultaneously. You can be ambitious and have a dimension of political calculation. You can also be loyal and honor your family. And George Herbert Walker Bush, as his father Prescott Bush demonstrated to him, proved to his sons, you can do those two things simultaneously. And one thing I think is worth remembering about George Herbert Walker Bush, the president, he actually took that approach as a president. There were times when he was fighting with Democrats over one issue and reconciling with them on another. Early in his presidency, we've talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act. He was moving that through Congress and getting it signed at exactly the same time he was vetoing a Democrats' reauthorization of the Civil Rights Act. That veto angered Democrats as he was working with them on the Americans with Disabilities Act. Ultimately, they reconciled a year later, but that is symbolic and illustrative of this approach to politics. You can do many things at the same time. They're not necessarily contradictory. Sometimes they're strategic, and sometimes they all land well. And I think one of the things looking back on the George Herbert Walker Bush presidency, he had a lot of skills, and many more things landed well than were appreciated at the time.
Major, what were the ambitions of Prescott Bush, George H.W. Bush's father, for the children?
That they serve the country, first and foremost, in whatever way they thought best. And I can't remember, because I'm not as familiar with the deep family history, if the father was enamored of George Herbert Walker Bush's move to Texas. It felt, reading the biographies that I have, that was a bit unusual and kind of a striking out, kind of a westward expansion of his own and a definition of his own approach to success and the way he wanted to not only pursue it but try to define it. And then going to Houston, he becomes a congressman. And I remember during the Bush presidency, then Bill Archer, who was the ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, eventually became chairman of it, used to joke with George Herbert Walker Bush, you know, if you'd stayed in Congress, you could have been me, and nearly as powerful as me, running the entire tax code. You got the consolation prize. You got to be president of the United States. That's the kind of Texas humor that they exchanged between Republicans in those days.
Chip, what are you seeing there in College Station? Chip Reed is on location for us at Texas A&M. Chip, what are you seeing there?
We're not seeing anything here yet of the motorcade, but we are seeing the Corps of Cadets line up over here, and we can see some of them holding what appear to be bugles, so there's going to be some music coming from them. And one of the things, of course, that we're looking forward to at this point is that once the president's casket arrives here and is removed from the hearse and they start the music, they play Hail to the Chief, and they play the Star-Spangled Banner, it's at about that time, according to the official schedule, that there will be this extraordinary flyover. The Navy has never done a 21 fighter jet F-18 Hornet flyover, but they're going to do 21 jets here, weather permitting, but it looks like it's going to happen, and they will do the missing man maneuver at the very end where one of the planes ascends straight up, the symbolism there being that the fallen man is ascending to heaven. Jeff?
Be pretty fitting if the clouds cleared just in time for that to happen. That maneuver that'll be attempted today, weather permitting, is also a tribute, obviously, to George H.W. Bush, the pilot, who flew and served admirably, remarkably admirably in World War II, has been noted here many times, and should be, and will be noted again. It's interesting, Major talks about the extravagance of the ceremonies and the number of days, Ed, that it takes. But you're right. Every single face you're looking at here is going to be able to say, "I took part in this, and I watched this."
In virtually all these cases, especially these young men and women in uniform, they were not alive when he was in office. They might even have just fleeting memories of George W. Bush's presidency, because of course so many in the military at that young age are in their early 20s. So
it speaks to the power of the presidency to send enduring and rippling messages over the ages. Those who participated, whether they were singing in a choir, law enforcement, the military you're seeing right now, they're serving. And they've heard for a week now the definition of George Herbert Walker Bush's approach to service. That's going to echo for their families. It's going to echo for their children, possibly for their grandchildren. One of the things that our country does, has been very good at, is creating these definitional moments that are important in of themselves, but then create an echo that inspires someone else, that encourages someone else to do something in a way that they might not have originally imagined. I have a feeling after this week, we'll have some of that as well.
I would say you're right about that, Major. And it's interesting to note that some of the people, many of the folks you're watching here now, also participated in the ceremony and services for Barbara Bush just a few months ago. So they had a chance to say they were part of both of these somber yet both celebratory events for Barbara Bush and George H.W. Bush. It's been pretty amazing to see the reaction both in D.C. yesterday and also the people lining the train of people stopping what they're doing, whether it's workers on an unfinished construction building in D.C., all just turning around and stopping and looking at the hearse pass by, or people lining up along this train route.
It was 12 years ago this month that Gerald R. Ford died, so it's been 12 years since we buried a president, and they are a pretty remarkable feat of, frankly, of logistics. You know, these take years to plan and are very well documented. In this case, for Bush, he's been working on it for more than 25 years, really, down to asking his friends to eulogize him. In 2009, Union Pacific, that provided today's train, was asked to do so at his request because he wanted to take this train ride. Texas A&M University when they came to him back in the late 80s and said, we'd love to, house your museum. Undoubtedly knew that this day would come. And even as Jan told us earlier today, the Oak Ridge boys have been traveling the country with their funeral suits in recent months, knowing that they might have to perform at a moment's notice at his funeral.
And there's the multi-generational impact. I mean, you talk about the Oak Ridge boys performing who had been playing for President Bush since 1983. And then today, as you mentioned, students who weren't even alive when George H.W. Bush occupied the Oval Office climbed to the top of parking garages, stood on light poles or in the beds of pickup trucks just to get a glimpse of the plane that carried President Bush's body from Washington to Houston. Students, many of them, they stood in silence. They just wanted to look. They weren't alive when George H.W. Bush served. But to Major's point, it speaks to the American tradition.
And the other unique factor here, of course, is George W. Bush. The military, as they've done this, is not only honoring one of their former commander-in-chiefs, but another former commander-in-chief has been watching the whole time. So in essence, they've been serving two masters, one who has died and another who is grieving, and another for whom one day we will undoubtedly see similar services. And it must, unique
as any Texan will tell you, everything is bigger in Texas. Texas has not just one, not two, but three presidential libraries.
That's right.
President George Herbert Walker Bush at Texas A&M, President George W. Bush at Southern Methodist University, and Lyndon Johnson at the University of Texas. That in itself is unique among states in our republic.
Yeah, and as we talk about the, as we watch the casket move in here to Texas A&M, Major, any was there? I know there was a lot of consideration for the former president about where the library would be, Rice, Yale, or Texas A&M, back in the mid to late 90s. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a competitive thing for sure. Universities vie for these things and make different bids and make different presentations. And Texas A&M was deeply aggressive about this. It wanted a library of its own to not only honor President George Herbert Walker Bush, but also to compete against other libraries at University of Texas and possibly others, to plant a flag for their own studies in political science, which I know are formidable. So libraries for presidents located near universities are multipliers in lots of different ways, not only in terms of research, but in publicity and in the centrality of all presidential libraries. So it's a competitive process. And there are parts of George Herbert Walker Bush's orientation to Texas and public education. Remember, he wanted to be, and often said he aspired to be, the education president. His son took on that mantle when he became president. And so public education is also a defining part of his orientation toward his legacy, though he was privately educated himself. And Texas A&M is the largest public college in Texas, one of the largest in the entire country. I believe this year's current enrollment is just north of 64,000. So it is a huge campus, one of the biggest, obviously, in Texas, one of the biggest in the country, and a place that not only back then fought for the university library itself, for the presidential library itself, but wants to be a part of everything discussed about George Herbert Walker Bush in the future.
Major, and so you've talked about this before, Major, too, but I mean, we talk about that service. I mean, career politician is used in the pejorative these days. And George H.W. Bush felt how about that?
Well, certainly, for example, he runs for the House, he wins the House in Houston. Richard Nixon talks him in 1970 to running for the Senate. He runs and loses. Then he gets a consolation prize. What was that? Head of the Republican National Committee. Heading into Watergate. Wow, that was tough, but he took it because he was a party man. Then he becomes first envoy to China, hoping he might be on a vice presidential ticket. That's a disappointment, but he takes another party role. Does the CIA also as a party role, doing a job that was required for the government to function, but also for him to maintain a sense of being in the party and taking on hard tasks. A part of his service, yes, but also part of his ambition. And again, as we've said, you can say both are true at the same time. You can serve and be ambitious simultaneously. And there are parts of George Herbert Walker Bush's resume that indicate that quite specifically. And he waited and worked and learned and applied himself. And as we've said quite often during this commemoration and celebration, he may have been the most qualified person going into the presidency because of that persistence, that sense of service, and it's okay to say, a measure of ambition.
Hearse just now making its way down Barbara Bush Drive, finishing at this extraordinary scene of 1,650 cadets lining the way and paving the path for this procession of vehicles as they all stand and watch and pay their respects. 1,650 cadets.
Ready, stop!
Reaching the moment soon when they will attempt this momentous flyover, including this missing man maneuver that we've been talking about. Previous presidents have all received the flyover from 21 fighter planes, but in this particular case, one of these fighter jets will then attempt to peel away, which will be a pilot's tribute to the president who was a pilot and who was shot down in World War II and survived. So 2 of his crewmen were killed. One of the reasons why he didn't want to talk about it. The son, George W., was leading that walk. looks like they did it. And what the Navy says is the largest ever missing man formation maneuver. There was some concern the weather might interfere with that. But how about that?
21 different F-18s involved in that, yeah. So former naval pilot, that's quite an honor from
Oh boy.
the branch he served. For now, at least, the last military veteran to serve as, or to see combat veteran to have seen, to have served in office. We should remind people, Jeff, he's going to lie in a private burial plot there on the campus of A&M and at the library alongside his wife Barbara and their daughter Robin. And his office had tweeted out earlier today that back in 1991 he wrote to his children making clear that he wanted to be in a spot alongside his wife. At the gravestone should just be plain white stone like those we see at Arlington National Cemetery or other national cemeteries around the world. And all he wanted inscribed on his tombstone was his Navy number, which he believed was 0173464. And then he wanted it to say on his gravestone, quote, he loved Barbara very much.
I think you'll get that.
I think he will, yeah.
Which you're gonna, so the Bush family, you know, will proceed to the gravesite eventually here as the casket is carried through a military cordon. Eventually, once the family crosses the bridge here, this will become an entirely private ceremony. But when the family is there, there'll be 20 chairs for them at the gravesite for family members. A service bulletin will be handed out to the family. The casket will be prepared, and then the family will move into position for a private service, which will be conducted by Dr. Levinson and also the Reverend Peter Cheney. We've seen so much from Dr. Russell Levinson over the past few days, including a moving speech today during the service in Houston. Dr. Levinson is in the middle there, directly in front of the casket right now.
Hold.
And then coming up here in 3 minutes, an Arlington bugler has arranged a tribute for military buglers across the country to sound taps at 5:30 Eastern Time in George H.W. Bush's honor. 250 buglers are signed up around the country to play taps in synchronicity as we hit the bottom of the hour and as the family prepares to say one final goodbye in a private service at College Station. It is not long after the family crosses this bridge that what has been a 6-day public mourning period that they've shared with America will become a much smaller and intimate goodbye.
His 5 surviving children and their spouses, his 17 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren, his younger brother, and just a few other family friends will be at that service. And you've seen the gentleman who was in full military uniform that's escorted them all week, Major General Michael Howard, who's based in Washington.
Let future generations understand the burden and the blessings of freedom. Let them stay we stood where duty required us to stand. President George H.W. Bush, January 1991. Major Garrett, as we prepare to leave the air here, as the Bush family prepares to say one final goodbye, you've talked about how important these rituals are.
Mm-hmm. They are. They are. They're a way for the country not just to think about the present, but to pause. I mean, all of this has moved very slowly. We've had a chance to put down our phones for at least a day or two, or maybe just an hour or two, and reflect on something central to the American experience, a presidency that was and a legacy that is, what it means to us now, where we write about what we thought about it then. All these things have been part and parcel of the appreciation and commemoration of President George Herbert Walker Bush. And near the end of his first term, he began to publicly ruminate about politics at that time, 1992, saying he felt it was becoming already too rancorous. He said there was a sloganeering infecting American politics. He said the solutions that matter are the ones that work, not that sound exciting or catchy. And he warned politicians of that era, if you choose your party over the country, you will invite defeat, and you will most certainly deserve it. Words worth pondering as we bring this commemoration and celebration to a close.
Absolutely. And as the family prepares to begin their private goodbye here again, and as we close in on ending our coverage of the goodbye to President George H.W. Bush, our 41st American president, we will have more coverage of the farewell to the president on your local news on this CBS station, on our streaming service CBSN, and we will see you in just under an hour on for the first edition of the CBS Evening News tonight. Until then, for Ed O'Keefe here in the studio, Major Garrett in our D.C. bureau, and Chip Reed at College Station, I'm Jeff Glor, CBS News in New York.